A majority of voters say climate change is an important issue in the 2020 presidential election. So how is the environment playing in swing states? This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant.
And I'm Reed Frazier. The Pew Research Center says the economy, healthcare, and the COVID-19 pandemic are the most important issues for voters this year. But especially among Democrats, concern over climate change is growing.
So we're looking at what role climate change and other environmental issues could play in deciding the election. Today, we check in with reporters in major battleground states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, to find out.
In Michigan, these issues have touched everyone from auto workers to anglers. Pennsylvania has been the focus of the fracking debate, and in Florida, offshore drilling and sea level rise has in some ways united both parties.
First up, we talk with Alex Harris. She's a climate reporter with the Miami Herald. Hi, Alex.
Hi there. How's it going?
Good, thanks. Thanks for joining us. So Florida has a significant number, 29 electoral votes, a well-known swing state. Trump took the state in 2016, but won by only 1 percentage point over Hillary Clinton. In terms of the issues we're talking about today, how important do you think the environment, climate change is to voters in Florida this time around?
I think that's one of the billion-dollar questions this election cycle. There's a lot of issues that everyone, both sides are kind of pegging on to say, is this going to sway enough voters? And with Florida being the huge swing state it is, there are a lot of niche issues like climate change that have drawn a lot of attention from both sides of the party. In Florida, it's hard to tell. With climate change, I see a lot of energy about climate solutions and adaptation from younger voters. And a recent poll that Florida Atlantic University did in February found that most people in Florida, 86%, understand that climate change is happening and that's affecting their state. And that includes 81% of Republicans and 91% of Democrats, 87% of independents. So it's a well understood issue for most of Florida. This poll and other ones have found. The difference is that not everyone agrees on the solutions or what needs to be done, or it doesn't top the plate for most people.
I see, but that's interesting because I assume that's much higher than your average state because Florida has so much coastline. Is that why?
Yeah, I mean, we are the most vulnerable state in the nation by many metrics. Buildings at risk, people at risk, inches of coastline at risk. There's a good study out from Yale that kind of talks a little bit about how different regions react to climate change and understand the science and understand how it's going to affect them. And Florida ranks considerably high, even in some of the more rural red areas of the state, because extreme heat is affecting us. Mosquito-borne illness is already affecting parts of the inland of the state. We saw a spread of Zika in South Florida a couple of years ago. And obviously, king tide and sea level rise is a very visible facet of every fall in most parts of the coast.
You're saying, despite all this, even though there is kind of a lot of knowledge around the state, people understand that this is happening, they're seeing evidence around them, it doesn't top the list for most people. You know, where do we have any sense of where climate change and the environment rank in terms of importance for voters in Florida?
I haven't seen any polls that talk about the importance of climate. I know it's been growing for years, and I would say the conversation on the Republican side of the ticket, which Republicans control the House and the Senate and the governor's office in Florida, even though it's a decidedly purple state, they have done a much better job at, rounding up the vote. And the conversation on the Republican side of Florida has really changed from climate change isn't real to climate change is happening, but it's not affecting us, to, okay, it's happening, but how are we going to solve it without hurting the economy? So really, we've seen a tremendous shift. Our most recent governor, Ron DeSantis, walked into office and appointed a chief resilience officer and talked about putting more money into planning for coastal states. Of course, that's very, agnostic adaptation. It talks a lot about, are we going to give you money for infrastructure and not, are we going to reduce carbon dioxide? But it is an issue that even some of the redder parts of the state are starting to care about. I don't know if it ranks above the economy or healthcare or some of the key central issues that affect obviously everyone in the country. But it's definitely growing in Florida. It's a bigger issue here than it is, I would say, in most other states.
Well, it's interesting with the presidential race this year. President Trump, 2 years ago, 2018, he rolled out this big plan to allow offshore drilling along nearly the entire Atlantic coast, including Florida. But it sounds like that was not well received by people, by voters in Florida. What happened there?
That is an incredibly controversial decision he made. It was so controversial that almost every Republican in Florida spoke out against it. Both of our state senators, Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, both openly said immediately after, no, we won't allow offshore drilling in Florida. And part of it is because people in the state value their environmental resources, but mostly it's because that's our tourism. That's where our cruise ships go. It's where our fishermen go. It's a working coast. There's so much happening on that coast. And we all saw what happened with the Gulf oil spill, and it's a very vivid image in memories for most Floridians. And yes, Trump actually got himself a bunch of headlines, some press, and some positive attention from voters when he came down here earlier this year and signed a bill that would extend the ban and the moratorium on offshore drilling in Florida, because that is universally popular. It's a bipartisan thing. Nobody wants offshore drilling in Florida.
We've achieved energy independence, and we've done it while protecting our pristine environment. I recently signed an order placing a moratorium on offshore drilling off the coast of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and I decided to add Florida. Is that okay? We added Florida.
Is this just a political move? Do people see through that? Or do you think the fact that he's saying, hey, we're not going to allow this offshore drilling is enough for a lot of people to say, okay?
I mean, obviously, the left wing has, in Florida, specifically saw right through it and called that out as a election ploy to draw a little bit of positive environmental attention. And they talked a lot about how he has a very terrible track record of getting rid of environmental protections at the federal level. And the moratorium he signed is not permanent. It could be reversed the day after the election. He didn't put anything into law. He just did an executive order. So that was a point of concern for a lot of environmentalists here. Even Republicans have sort of talked about they'd like to see some stronger protections on offshore drilling to really prevent it for good and not just at the whims of whoever is at the political reins.
Interesting from what you said earlier, though, this isn't necessarily an environmental issue as much as it is a business tourism kind of an industry concern. So I guess as a show that's trying to focus on kind of what are environmental issues around the country that might make a difference in the election, do you see this as an environmental issue, as more of a business issue in Florida?
I think it can be both. I think it's the same issue viewed through two different lenses, right? The Republicans look at it as, we want to protect the quality of our water so that we continue fishing, so we can continue cruising, so we can continue having gorgeous beaches to have tourists come to our hotels. And maybe Democrats look at it as saying, yes, we want to have the diverse wildlife and pristine habitats that keep people coming back to our state, that the residents of the state can continue to enjoy for years. I think it's a very similar when you talk about water releases from our biggest lake in our state, Lake Okeechobee, that causes algae that goes up and down either river. And it's a red and blue issue. It's a bipartisan issue that it's an environmental crisis. It kills manatees, it kills fish, it clogs the water. And everybody is pretty much united on not wanting it to happen. And it is one of the few, there are several environmental issues in Florida that really do cross both party lines. Offshore drilling is one of them. Green algae, red tide, some of these bigger, more dramatic environmental issues really do. Both parties walk hand in hand on it.
So let's switch gears. In 2016, a majority of the Latino voters in Florida supported Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump only won the state by 1%, as we mentioned. So one thing I've been wondering about is, there's some research out there that shows Latino voters are among the most concerned people in the country about climate change, more so than white voters. What kind of difference do you think the Latino vote, and especially people who are concerned about climate change within the Latino community, what difference might that make in the election in Florida?
I think that's a good question, but a tricky one. So in a lot of parts of the state, there's a instinct among white pollsters to kind of flatten the Latino community into they all vote the same way, which, as any Floridian knows, that's absolutely not true. So there are obviously many subgroup populations. South Florida has a lot of Cuban Republicans. And they are very conservative. They don't really talk much about climate change and environmental issues. They talk a lot about fiscal conservatism. They talk a lot about immigration, and that this is not a concern for them. And that is the majority of especially the politicians in power in South Florida. But you go up to more North Florida and Central Florida, and you get Puerto Ricans who care a little bit more about the environment, obviously, because they saw what Hurricane Maria did to their island, and they care a lot about resiliency. They care a lot about how FEMA works, how that money gets distributed to people who need it, and they definitely lean a little bit more left. And then you get, there's a hot fight between both parties for Venezuelans who do lean more red. And there's only about 50,000 of them in the state of Florida, but 50,000 is enough to sway a margin, as we saw in 2000, is more than enough to sway a margin. And so both parties are kind of fighting really hard to win each and every individual demographic of Latinos. And you'll see there are wild variations between each group and what they care about. But what's very clear in Florida is that, like every other state, brown and black people definitely are taking the brunt of the climate change. They're really feeling the effects more than a lot of other populations are, even though they've done the least to make it happen. And so that's definitely going to be an issue. If it's not as much of an issue now, it could be one moving forward, as these are the populations that feel the most effects of extreme heat. They're the ones who maybe have to ride a bike to work or take a bus to work and sit in an unshaded bus shelter. And resilience issues that are pocketbook issues are really something that is starting to hit home for them.
What do you mean by that? Resilience issues that are pocketbook issues, yeah.
So the way we talk about climate change a lot in South Florida is not necessarily the same like national way of like, oh, this is an existential crisis. We need to talk about reducing carbon dioxide levels, which is absolutely true. The conversation in Florida is much more adaptation focused. Like, how do we build a community that is safer for us to live in moving forward? How do we raise our roads, install our pumps? How do we not gentrify people out of these more safe areas that we're creating? And so that really brings in the equity lens. And we talk a lot about Hispanic, Latino, and black populations and how investment will either, make things more equal for them or increase the inequity in these communities. And that comes to how much does insurance cost? What kind of health effects are you feeling from extreme heat or mosquito-borne illnesses? And is your property value going down? Do you live in a low-lying community that floods a lot whenever it rains hard or the sea level rise or king tides come up?
That's really interesting because I wonder if people kind of make that connection or how many people are making that connection to who they vote for president this year.
There are a lot of progressive groups trying extremely hard this year to make that connection for people. They call it connecting the dots. Catalyst, Miami, the Clio Institute, a lot of League of Conservation Voters. There's a lot of political organizations that are specifically going to communities where voting maybe isn't a priority for them because they've got to, pay the bills, take their kids to soccer practice, do whatever we used to do pre-pandemic, and trying to convince them that their vote matters because of climate change and that climate change is an issue they should be considering when they vote. It's still hard to break through, though, for especially some communities because economic issues are their priority right now. Am I going to get a better job? Is the economy going to improve? Am I going to make more money, be able to afford my apartment, to afford to send my kids to school, get good health care? Those issues, I think, still reign supreme, but there is a concerted effort that I've seen make a difference in the last 3 or 4 years to convince these communities that climate change isn't just a long-term issue. It is a current issue that they could have sway in with their vote now.
You've all seen the impact, more than most. Devastating hurricanes that lay waste to whole communities. Economic toll is astounding. It grows every year. And the human toll is worse. When you talk about global warming, Donald Trump thinks hoax. Combating climate change means jobs.
Well, Alex Harris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alex Harris is climate reporter with the Miami Herald. Next up, Reed checks in on the key state of Pennsylvania.
I have never said I oppose fracking.
You said it on tape.
I did show the tape. Put it on your website.
I'll put it on.
Put it on the website.
In Pennsylvania, President Trump has made fracking an issue, or at least tried to. The state is the nation's number 2 producer of natural gas, thanks to fracking. Susan Phillips covers energy for WHYY in Philadelphia and StateImpact Pennsylvania. Susan, President Trump says Joe Biden would ban fracking. That's not true. Biden has said he would not ban fracking. Can you just explain what Joe Biden does say about fracking? What is his stance?
So what he says is he wants to halt or stop all new leases, oil and gas leases on federal land. There's very, very little federal land in the state of Pennsylvania. The bulk of fracking happens on private land or state land. In fact, when I was just curious to find out how much happens on federal land, because the only federal land we have where fracking is occurring in the state is in the Allegheny National Forest. And I got information from the Bureau of Land Management, and it was like 800 acres of land. It's a very tiny portion of the entire state where fracking occurs on federal land.
So most fracking is on what, private or, Pennsylvania state-owned lands?
Right. Most fracking in Pennsylvania, if not 99.9% of fracking in Pennsylvania, happens on private or state-owned land, and a president cannot ban that. That would require an act of Congress.
But there is some difference in the two candidates in terms of maybe not banning fracking, but where they stand on fossil fuels more broadly and how they relate to climate change. How are they different? Maybe we'll start there.
Yes, there is a significant difference between Trump and Biden when it comes to climate change and, as a result, fossil fuels. So Trump essentially doesn't take climate change seriously. He doesn't have a plan to tackle climate change. He talks about planting 1 trillion trees, but that's really not going to do what needs to be done to halt carbon emissions. He wants to go full force with fossil fuel development. So what Biden wants to do is get to zero emissions from the power sector by 2035. So that means, when we say power sector, that means the power plants that generate electricity. And he wants to get to net zero by 2050 for the entire economy. To do those things, yes, you would have to reduce significantly the amount of fossil fuels that we are using specifically to produce electricity. We would have to transition to wind, solar power rather than using coal, oil, or natural gas.
That would probably impact the fracking business, especially in a state like Pennsylvania, where there's a lot, natural gas is a big portion, and coal still are big portions of where we get our electricity from.
Right, exactly. In a broader policy sense, while he's not in favor of banning fracking, the idea that you would use less natural gas to generate electricity could, in fact, reduce the amount of natural gas production that's happening. Of course, that's not taking into consideration the amount of natural gas that would be used to produce plastics, right? And they're building a new cracker plant out in your neck of the woods near Pittsburgh. But also the natural gas producers in the state are also exporting natural gas overseas. So there still seems to be a vibrant market for natural gas, and that's why we're still seeing pipeline projects getting put in the ground. We're still seeing export plants. There's a new LNG export terminal planned for the Delaware River in New Jersey. It's unclear whether that transition to clean burning fuel will completely eliminate fossil fuel production, because, of course, we use fossil fuel for things other than generating electricity.
And LNG, that's liquefied natural gas, basically.
Yes, liquefied natural gas. That's taking natural gas and basically freezing it to the point where it becomes a liquid and you can ship it overseas.
Fracking, I did a story on this as a reporter in the spring. It was a kind of thought to be a wedge issue in Pennsylvania in the primary, back when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were calling for a ban. Why is Trump picking this issue right now? You've done some reporting on this.
Yeah, and, it's not because the voters in Pennsylvania have this as a primary issue in the election, right? I mean, you talk to voters and all the polls suggest that the main issues are coronavirus, economy, and healthcare. So fracking is really way down at the bottom of the list, even for those who have a direct stake in fracking, people who may work in the industry or may have leased their land to natural gas producers. Even those folks, fracking is not at the forefront when it comes to this election. But Trump is hammering it over and over and over again, and you heard that Thursday night in the debate. Essentially what it means is, he's trying to define himself and define Biden. I'm for this, he's against it. That's what a wedge issue is. It's sort of like very cut and dry. I'm for this, he's not. Rather than, if he were to address his track record on the coronavirus, he may be going down, a slippery slope because, by all accounts, he's done such a bad job tackling the coronavirus. And also, he doesn't have a health care plan. So he's not going to be talking about the health care. He has been talking about the economy. every chance he can get, he throws fracking in there.
You know, in Pennsylvania, the polls are basically split on fracking. It's like half the people are in favor, the other half are against.
It's more specific when you look at the rural and urban split, though.
Okay, yeah, talk about that, because it's like, well, what are you trying to do there? Are there people who would be voting for Biden, but, you know, even if it's a small percentage, I guess it could tip the election. What is the target for this message?
The target is the rural voters. You know, it's not the urban folks in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. I think he realizes he's not going to win those areas. What he wants is to get people from rural Pennsylvania who have a stake in fracking out to the polls and out to make sure they vote for him.
And in your reporting, did you find voters who, you know, this marginal voter who might go for Joe Biden, but, you know, they're worried about him
but for
fracking?
No,
yeah.
I couldn't find anyone who cared about fracking. I couldn't find any voter who cared about fracking, whether they were for or against. I mean, if I asked them about it, they would talk about it. But if I asked them, what are your issues in the campaign? Nobody brought it up. Everybody brought up the economy, coronavirus, and healthcare.
Thanks, Susan.
You're welcome.
That's Susan Phillips, energy reporter at WHYY in Philadelphia. I'm Reed Frazier. Next up, we're headed up north to the battleground state of Michigan.
I've been here many times. I say we want car plants built here, and we're building a lot of them. We're building a lot of them.
That speaks to the power of you. And you all know that. That's why on this Sunday afternoon, we're all hanging out in the parking lot of UAW.
We're talking with Lester Graham. He's a reporter with the Environment Report at Michigan Radio. Hey, Lester.
Hi, Julie.
You're in Michigan, as we mentioned. 16 electoral votes are in play there. What are some of the environmental issues you see as potentially bringing voters to the polls and making a difference?
Well, Michigan is the Great Lakes state, right? We're surrounded by four of the five Great Lakes. And so there's a lot of concern about water, about air, loss of wetland protections, and so forth. We've seen a lot of rollbacks by the U.S. EPA and the Department of Energy, for that matter, and that affects a lot of different levels of Michigan life.
Are there things in there that are actually, you think, might get voters to say, hey, I want more environmental protection? And what does that mean in terms of how they might vote?
I think everybody is occupied about what's happening with the COVID pandemic first, right? So climate change and environmental protections, while really important to a number of people, that's not really what they're talking about at this point. However, environmentalists and people in environmental groups are really looking at some of these rollbacks, and they're appalled by it. I think the New York Times said, well, I've got the headline here, the Trump administration is reversing nearly 100 environmental rules, and that causes a lot of concern, especially when we're seeing places like our neighboring state, Wisconsin, granting waivers to a power plant to allow more mercury to be emitted. And mercury is a toxic chemical that gets into the fish in the Great Lakes and then gets into us because we eat it.
Yeah, you mentioned the COVID pandemic, but sort of the twin issue with that is the economy. So in Michigan, of course, I'm thinking about the auto industry.
And frankly, your car business, they ought to get in gear because they're so afraid of the environmentalists. You know, they're so afraid. Oh, I don't know. I mean, they're willing to spend thousands more to build a car. I say, fellas, are you sure?
President Trump has done what he thinks and some of the car companies think are good for the auto industry in reducing emission standards. So under President Obama, there was a requirement that new cars, I'm not sure what the year was, by a certain year would have a mileage standard of 54.5 miles per gallon.
Across the fleet, yeah.
And Trump has said, no, we're going to put that down to 40. So it's kind of an interesting phenomena there because you have unions that used to support the Democratic candidate last time around in 2016, supported President Trump over Hillary Clinton. So how does this all look to you?
Let's start with the corporations themselves. You know, we've got the big three automakers, GM, Fiat Chrysler, and Ford. GM and Fiat Chrysler support these rollbacks of the fuel efficiency standards. Ford's taking a different tack. They agree at Ford that they should back the stricter standards. They want California to be setting limits. It pushes the industry toward that goal of becoming more fuel efficient, less emissions, and knowing that it all has an impact on climate change. So that's a split. Now, you mentioned unions, and you correctly pointed out that in 2016, the unions themselves didn't necessarily support Trump, but the union membership did. And it's kind of the same way here. I looked at the United Auto Workers, the strongest and most significant union in Michigan. And the United Auto Workers union is backing Joe Biden for president. However, we're wondering what will that mean among the union membership? Because as you rightly pointed out, in 2016, a lot of them went for Trump. And the question is, are we going to see that same percentage of union membership go into the Trump camp again this time, or will they switch back and go where the union leadership would like them to go, and that's to vote Democrat?
So we are here with the UAW. We are here with the heart and soul of the labor movement in America. There is nothing that we cannot make happen when we do things together. The beautiful thing about this team sport called democracy is voting is something we do together. So thank you for using your voice like it's never been heard before in Michigan.
Let me give you an illustration of what I'm seeing in Michigan. So I'm a wildlife photographer, among other things. I go out in the rural areas and try to photograph whatever I can find. In the rural areas, you almost never see a Biden sign, but you see all kinds of Trump signs and Trump flags, and some of these houses are decorated to the hilt with support for Donald Trump. And then you get back into just about any town, and almost all you see is Biden signs. It's all blue signs. And it's very interesting to see that these two cultures are so separated. And I never thought about it being that simple, rural versus city. I'm not saying there aren't people in my town who don't support Donald Trump, certainly. And there are, once in a while you might see a Biden sign out in the rural areas. But overwhelmingly, it's red and it's blue.
How do we tie this back to an environmental issue here, what I brought up, the car companies themselves and whether or not they want to move forward and see lower emission standards, or if they liked what Obama did and sort of pushing them to get more fuel efficient?
I think that people think that cars are small enough and fuel efficient enough with gasoline around $2 a gallon, right? There's not the financial incentive to give up your bigger SUV, as a lot of people have done lately. But I think the companies, even though GM and Fiat Chrysler are in favor of rollbacks on CAFE standards, fuel efficiency standards, I think the companies really know that any kind of change like that is going to be very temporary. And I think that's why Ford has decided, look, we know in the long term we've got to get there. The political pressure and the public pressure are going to grow as we go along, so we need to do it now. I'm sure those discussions are being held within GM and Fiat Chrysler, but it's not coming up with the same results at this point. Another thing that is really worrisome, the Trump administration rolled back protection for minor streams and wetlands areas that are separate from a larger body of water. And that's become a real concern among a lot of people, the environmentalists, of course, but some anglers are really worried about that because you're taking away protections from little streams that might not be that significant, but could carry a significant amount of pollution into the trout streams that they fish and things like that. And wetlands, wetlands are the beginning of life for any large body of water. I mean, that's where the fish eggs are laid many times, and the fry come from there and go into the larger body of water. And a lot of the lower part of the food web begins in a wetland. And so people are hunters here, and they're anglers, and they know that, there's a direct impact. So it might be a celebration among Well, in particular farmers, because they've had to be really careful around streams and put in a lot of buffer zones and always worrying about hassle from the government, which, farmers really don't want. They want to be left alone, right? They want to do their thing. They don't want the government coming in and telling them what to do on their farm.
I don't know about in Michigan, but I think nationwide a lot of farmers have really supported those changes to the Clean Water Act.
Absolutely, because it just means a lot less hassle for them.
So we'll have to see. Any predictions on what may happen?
I'm like everybody else. I'm looking at the polls. I'm trying to figure out if the polls are going to be any better than they were in 2016. I'm especially looking at those state polls because those are the ones that count in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, right? We want to know where those three states are going because they're going to be significant in this election. And at this point, it looks like Biden leads by 7, 8, sometimes double-digit points, depending on the poll. But again, in the polling in 2016, Hillary Clinton was leading by 3 and 5 points and so forth, and then lost those states. So I don't think we're going to know. We can't predict safely who is going to win, whether President Trump will be reelected or whether Joe Biden will be the new president. I'd like to say we'll find out November 3rd. I don't think we'll know November 3rd. It might be November 6th or later before that happens. And I think people are going to get pretty agitated about that delay.
For sure. Although I think we're all being prepped for it. Well, Lester, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Good to talk to you, Julie.
That was Lester Graham with the Environment Report at Michigan Radio.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Probably other places too, but we'll get into that later. Write us a review and tell your friends. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier.
And I'm Julie Grant. We'll see you next time.